Hey guys, welcome to the first reaction video on this channel. Maybe it'll be the last reaction video. Maybe it's the first of many. We'll see how this one's received, I suppose. So I thought I would do a reaction, and first of all, I wanted to do something related to World War One, because that's one of my, I suppose, kind of main topics. That and World War Two, probably. And I thought I'd do something about the British section. And what I thought would be really interesting is to do a reaction to one of my favourite history YouTubers, Vlogging Through History, Chris at Vlogging Through History. He does lots of reaction videos himself, but he's done a video recently where he goes to some of the sites of the Somme and he talks about the Pals Battalions. So I thought that would be a really interesting video to react to, and perhaps give a British perspective to an American's video talking about the British section. I thought it'd be really good. I have watched this video once when it first came out, but I think I watched it late at night, so actually I can't really remember too much of what he talks about, so I'm quite excited to get into this again. Look, if you do like this video, make sure you subscribe, make sure you hit the like button for me, comment below, let me know if you enjoyed the reaction videos or not. Anyway, let's get into this and see what happens in Chris's video here. Let's go.
At the outbreak of World War I in August of 1914, Lord Kitchener, who was the British Secretary of State for War, believed very early on that overwhelming manpower would be the key to winning the war. So he began to look for ways to encourage men of all classes to join the British Army. Now, this was a concept that flew in the face of centuries of British military tradition, in which the British Army had always relied on a very small but professional group of soldiers. And they had always drawn the members of their officer class from the gentry, and the lower classes were where they got most of their enlisted.
So it's interesting. So a previous video I've done on this channel about the Battle of Mons and Nimy Bridge. Now in that battle, that was the professional British army that Chris is talking about. I mean, whilst that army was by no means wiped out at the Battle of Mons, it suffered a lot of casualties. And it became apparent very quick that they would need a much bigger army, and that's where this I guess kind of call to arms came from. The other bit that Chris talks about there is how the officers used to come from the gentry. Well, yeah, that was true. You know, you see some of these kind of old films, and the officers are frightfully posh. That's kind of where that came from. So it probably was still the case a lot, actually, in the First World War.
Men. But it was General Sir Henry Rawlinson who would go on to command the army here at the Somme, who suggested that men would be more inclined to enlist in the army if they knew that they were going to serve alongside their friends, family, and co-workers. And so he appealed to London stockbrokers to raise a battalion of men from the workers in the city of London to set an example. 1,600 men enlisted in what became the 10th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, the so-called Stockbrokers Battalion, within a week in late August of 1914. A few days later, the Earl of Derby decided to raise a battalion very similar to that out of men from Liverpool. Within 2 days, 1,500 men had joined this new battalion. Speaking to these men,
when you hear these numbers of the people who joined up to this it's maybe hard to imagine now, I suppose, because you know the military is a very different thing now. You don't just get like random volunteers who turn up and 6 months later they're in Afghanistan. There's a lot more training to it than that, but this isn't a time, I guess, where there was such like kind of feeling of loyalty and patriotism to the country that people were volunteering left, right, and centre. I mean, of course, in hindsight, you know the horrors of what they then went through in World War One. They didn't know that at the time. They didn't know that's what they were going to, of course. But they did get hundreds, thousands of people who volunteered. You know, people underage pretending they were older than they were to be able to go. People who were too old pretending they were younger to be able to go. They really did get thousands of people. It really was a lot.
And Lord Derby said, quote, This should be a battalion of pals, a battalion in which friends from the same office will fight shoulder to shoulder for the honor of Britain and for the credit of Liverpool, end quote. Within the next few days, 3 more battalions were raised in Liverpool. And so these 4 battalions formed the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th battalions of the King's Regiment. Encouraged by Lord Derby's success, Lord Kitchener promoted the idea of organizing similar recruitment drives all throughout Britain. By the end of September of 1914, more than 50 towns had formed Pals Battalions.
The famous poster, like with the guy with the hat pointing and the "Your country needs you." That's Lord Kitchener who is on that poster that he's talking about there.
The larger towns and cities were able to form several battalions each. So, for example, Manchester, they were able to raise 4 battalions in August and 4 more a few months later. From the perspective of the War Office, these PAL battalions were just an incredible experiment because they relieved the heavy strain not only on recruiting a suddenly much more expanded regular army, but they also relieved the financial strain because they decided in September of 1914 that the organizers of these battalions would be responsible for meeting the initial costs of their accommodation and other training costs until the War Office would take over. And that worked out really well for the War Office, but also for the men, because this meant that many of these new recruits in these PALS battalions were initially able to live at home. They would go to training during the day in their local community with the other men, and then they would come home after a day of basic training.
It's cool that he's got all these old photos in it.
The Accrington Pals are probably the best remembered of the battalions that were raised in the early months of the First World War in response to Kitchener's call for a volunteer army. Groups of friends from all walks of life in Accrington and its neighboring towns enlisted together to form their own battalion with a distinctively local identity. A month after the outbreak of the war, the Accrington Observer and Times newspaper of September 8, 1914, reported that the War Office had accepted an offer made by the mayor of Accrington, Captain John Harwood, to raise a complete battalion. When recruitment began on the 14th of September, 104 men were accepted in the first 3 hours. Brothers, cousins, friends, workmates enlisted together, and within 10 days, the Accrington Battalion had...
Now, the Accrington Pals is I guess, a great example of kind of what went wrong with the Pals battalions, and I think I remember from watching this video, that's kind of what we're going to talk about in a minute, but you just said it there, like friends, brothers, co-workers, all the men from kind of the local community, and it feels kind of obvious, but you think about what can go wrong when you have all that going on. But let's wait, because we'll get to that.
All but reached a full strength of 1,100 men. Now, around half the battalion had been recruited from Accrington. The majority of the remainder had been raised in neighboring towns such as Burnley, Chorley, and Blackburn. But they all came from basically the same area. Throughout the early months of the battalion's existence, the men trained and drilled in and around their hometowns, like most of the PALS battalions did. In February of 1915, they were given this magnificent send-off as they left Accrington for training at Carnarvon, where Lieutenant Colonel A.W. Rickman of the Northumberland Fusiliers took command of the battalion. In May of 1915, the battalion moved from Carnarvon to Penkridge Bank Camp near Rugeley, outside of Birmingham, where it joined the 12th, 13th, and 14th battalions of the York and Lancaster regiments to form the 94th Brigade of the 31st Division. The battalion made further moves in
There's something worth noting there. It's talking about, I think there's sometimes this perception from World War One that these, like, these Pals battalions were like rounded up and put on trucks and bang, straight over to France and get in the trenches, and it wasn't quite like that. There was a bit more to it, and sometimes, like, you hear in the timeline that they went through here, there was sometimes quite a delay in that time from when they got recruited to their basic training and their moving around camps and then getting shipped somewhere. So it wasn't, it maybe wasn't quite as kind of untrained as maybe people sometimes think when you're talking about World War One. They were certainly people without combat experience who were put into some of the most brutal combat you can imagine, but they weren't untrained, which is sometimes a perception that you get.
July and then in September of 1915, before they embarked in December for Egypt, of all places, to counter a Turkish threat against the Suez Canal. That danger soon passed, and in the last week of February of 1916, the 31st Division was ordered to France to take part in the preparations for the joint British and French attack that was to come here at the Somme.
Yeah, so the attack at the Somme was, it was supposed to be like a real joint attack with the British and the French. The problem was that the French kind of got drawn into some pretty heavy fighting down kind of further near like Verdun and places like that, which meant that then their resource and their ability to commit so much at the Somme was limited. So when you hear about the Somme, people always think like, a British attack, but it was actually joint with British and French, although the French involvement kind of, I guess, waned a little bit as we got sort of further into it. I love the amount of research that Chris does, like, the photos and the detail of the people he's talking about.
The objective of the Pals Battalions of the 94th Brigade was to capture the hilltop fortress of Serre and form a defensive flank facing northeast and north. They were the northernmost point on the attack at the Somme on July 1st. That attack was to be led by the 11th East Lancashires on the right and the 12th York and Lancasters, the Sheffield City Battalion, on the left.
I love this, like the way, I'm assuming this is footage that he's filmed himself with a drone, I would guess, but the detail of the perspective this gives you is awesome. You really can kind of see. I mean, I've been here to this area, and it gives a cool perspective of it, certainly. Look at that. Just in that shot there, you can see like 1, 2, 3 cemeteries. I know there's another one just off the picture to the right. You drive around this area of France, around the Western Front. These cemeteries are everywhere. I mean, everywhere. It really does. Just driving through that area really brings home the impact of what went on there.
The 1st and 2nd Barnsley Pals, the 13th and 14th York and Lancasters, were in support, in reserve, for those leading battalions. Facing them in Serre was the 169th Infantry Regiment of the German Army, the 8th Baden Infantry. On the 24th of June, as was true all the way along the line, the British artillery opened a bombardment that was to continue until the very morning of the attack. This bombardment was intended to destroy the German defenses, but also open holes in the barbed wire and allow for easy access to the strong points. But it failed to penetrate through to many of the underground shelters, and it left much of the barbed wire intact. In the early evening of the 30th of June,
that's probably one of the biggest things that they had with the first day of the Somme is just the massive kind of over expectation of what that artillery bombardment was going to achieve. It just didn't take out the German front lines like they thought it was going to. They were dug down in deep like tunnels and dugouts and stuff, and and it really, you know, all it did was signify to them that something big was about to happen, so that when the bombardment did stop, it was almost like an alarm to, like, right, get ready, because something is coming our way now. And yet it just didn't have the impact. The other problem they had is that loads of the shells were duds. They reckon like something like 20%, like 1 in 5 of the shells that got fired were duds, and just didn't go off and have the effect that they'd wanted.
The 11th East Lancashires left their camp at Warnemont Wood for a 7-mile journey to the trenches here in front of Serre. The lead elements didn't even arrive on the front until 2:40 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, July 1st, just a few hours before the attack was meant to commence. These areas were already heavily shell damaged. The buildup had not gone unnoticed by the Germans, and as daylight broke,
as what I'm saying. So, you know, it hadn't gone unnoticed, right? They were moving so many, you know. In fact, look, we didn't have like satellites and stuff like that back then, but you know, they had like you know, spotters, and they had aeroplane surveillance a little bit, and you know, so the Germans knew something was going on. You know, you can't sneak, you know, extra thousands of men into front lines, and you know, and stuff like that without it going totally unnoticed. So they knew something was going on.
The forward lines were getting pounded by German artillery.
This is the front line here. You can still see this if you go to Serre. That kind of line is like where the front line trench was. We've filmed a video about somebody in the 15th Battalion, which is a little bit further down the line here, which you guys won't have seen yet. That's a cool video that's coming soon.
The woods behind me today are known as Sheffield Memorial Park, and it's a place in honor of the members of the Pals Battalions who attacked here on the morning of July.
I'm probably pausing too much here, but Sheffield Memorial Park is a cool place to go. If you guys ever want to go and visit the Western Front in France, there's lots of great sites. You know, Newfoundland Memorial Park is really interesting, the area around Sunken Lane, but this place, it really does bring home like what went on there on the first day of the Somme. I'd really recommend this if you want to go and visit anywhere along the Western Front.
July 1st of 1916. But at the time, they were actually 4 distinct tiny copses of trees, and you can see how it runs all the way down. They've merged together. The trees have grown since then.
Oh, I didn't know that when I went.
Mark, Luke, and John. I'm standing in front of Mark right now, and if we turn around, just on the other side of that cemetery would have been the German lines. It was only about 300 yards. And so you could think,
yeah, that's one of the things to think about here, right? Is that the front lines weren't that far apart in this section of the Somme. In some of them, they were a little further apart. Like if you go a bit further south from there, towards like kind of Hawthorne Ridge, and a bit further like down in some of the area by Mametz, they were a little further apart. But in this section, they were not far apart. There were areas where they were closer than this, like Vimy Ridge and places like that, but they really were not far apart. So when you think about how much of a failure this attack was, when the piece of ground that they had to initially cover was so close, you just cannot imagine that much devastation in such a small area.
Think, okay, you know, 300 yards, we could do that. We can cross that amount of territory. Beyond that, right where the woods are is where the village of Serre is actually located. But it wasn't as easy as it looked, as the men found out very quickly. So here's a map that gives you a really good sense of things. We are right here on the edge. This is about where the Accrington Pals monument is. We are right on the edge of the attack line. This is the 11th Battalion, East Lancashire Regiment.
This is really great that they have this at Sheffield Memorial Park, because you can stand by this board and you can really get an understanding of what went on. It's really interesting. You really can get a feel for what happened there. They don't have this everywhere. They have this in some areas, but not everywhere. It's really good there.
The Accrington Pals, and then you can see the other Pals units, and they had moved up over time to where we are now. And then you can see the German lines. There was a machine gun right there. There's other ones here, here, here. And then you can see where they advanced throughout the day. There were 4 trench lines and then fortifications actually inside the town of Serre itself. Just a brutal place to attack.
You see how close, right? People coming out that tree line there with a machine gun this far away, like, oh.
At around 6:30 in the morning, the British artillery began its final bombardment of the German front lines. As shells continued to burst on the Germans' front trench, the men of the 3rd and 4th companies of the German 169th Infantry scrambled from underground shells, bringing up their machine guns, their rifles, and their grenades, ready to put them onto the attacking troops. At 7:30 a.m., the bombardment was lifted from the German front lines, and the leading waves of the Pals Battalions rose up and began to walk toward the German positions. They were convinced that the front lines had been eliminated.
Began to walk, right? Think about that. And that's what happened. They were told walk, because they didn't want them tripping on, barbed wire or in the big shell holes. They didn't necessarily think that they were going to be under that heavy fire. So walk to make sure you get to that frontline German trench safely, because tripping over something was what was going to get them hurt on that walk from the frontline trench to the German trench. It's crazy when you think about it in hindsight, but yeah.
And so there was really no threat, and so they walked. But they found out almost immediately in that 300 yards of deadly space that the Germans were very much active, and they tore huge holes in the advancing lines of infantry. One British observer likened the lines of dead to, quote, swaths of cut corn at harvest time. Now, as incredible as it seems, groups of Pals defied the machine gun fire. They threaded their way through the barbed wire, and they dropped into the German front line trenches. On their left, some of the 12th York and Lancasters also fought their way through, but it was all in vain. Behind them, the 3rd and 4th waves also suffered horrifying losses before they even reached no man's land because of the
to think about this is that it wasn't like one charge. They had 2nd wave, 3rd wave, 4th wave. Can you imagine being in like the 3rd wave of something like this when you've seen what's happened, you've seen what's coming? It's just crazy. But you hear stories, in diaries and accounts of people just pushing on and the bravery. The bravery.
German artillery. The leading companies of the 13th York and Lancasters were cut down. Some of the Pals, their officers having been killed or wounded, pressed on toward the town of Serre, and they were never seen again. The remaining survivors in the German front line, having received no reinforcements, were forced to withdraw. By 8 a.m., just 30 minutes into the fight, the battle for Serre was effectively over. The history of the East Lancashire Regiment in the Great War records that out of 720 Accrington Pals who took part in that attack, in just the span of a half hour, 584 were killed, wounded, or missing. Brigadier General H.C. Reese of the 94th Brigade said, quote, "The result of the high explosive shells, the shrapnel."
You you see, I mean, Chris is kind of moved there, right? Talking about this, you get that feeling there. You do. You kind of, and you have moments like that. I imagine what's happened to him just then is you kind of almost, maybe even subconsciously, when you're talking about it, you realise that happened there, like where you're stood, and there's like a feeling comes over you in places like this. It's he's done a good job of this, right? A good job.
The machine gun fire and the rifle fire was such that hardly any of our men even reached the German front trench. The lines which advanced in such admirable order melted away under fire, yet not a man wavered. Not a man broke the ranks or attempted to go back. I have never seen, indeed could never have imagined, such a magnificent display of gallantry, discipline, and determination. Now, back home in England, the initial accounts of success on the Somme, including an erroneous report of the capture of the town of Serre, soon gave way to newspaper pages filled with photographs of the killed, wounded, and missing. Few, if any, of the town's population could have been untouched by the tragedy. Percy Holmes, who was the brother of one of the original members.
So, just talking about the community being untouched by the tragedy, right? This was the problem. This was the problem with the Pals Battalions, is that you had, like, you know, in some cases, like Accrington Pals is a great example, just like a whole generation of men just wiped out from a village, and that was the problem with the Pals Battalions, is that when a battalion had heavy casualties, well, that meant that all those heavy casualties were from the same area. You know, you get it. Just, I mean, the devastation it would have had on families, the economy, everything in these areas, just devastating.
Members of the Pals recalled, quote, "I remember when the news came through to Accrington that the Pals had been wiped out. I don't think there was a street in Accrington that didn't have their blinds drawn, and the bell at Christ Church tolled all the day." Sergeant John William Streets, who was one of the Pals. He was in the 12th Battalion, York and Lancaster, the Sheffield Pals. He was also a poet. He wrote these words: "Behind that long and lonely trenched line to which men come and go, where brave men die, there is a yet unmarked and unknown shrine, a broken plot, a soldier's cemetery." Sergeant Streets was killed in the attack on Serre on the morning of July 1st. His body lay in no man's land, as thousands of others did, for almost 10 months before he was eventually recovered, and he was believed to have been buried here at the Euston Road Cemetery. He was 31 years old. This is a memorial to him. Around the time his body was recovered, a collection of poems that he wrote was posthumously published under the title The Undying Splendor. And this is what he wrote: "Reach out thy hands, thy spirit's hands to me, and pluck the youth, the magic from my heart, magic of dreams, whose sensibility is plumed like the light, visions that start, mad pressure in the blood, desire that thrills, the soul with mad delight to yearning wed, all slothfulness of life draw from its bed, the soul of dawn across the twilight hills. Reach out thy hands, O Spirit, till I feel that I am fully thine, for I shall live in the proud consciousness that thou dost give. And if thy twilight fingers round me steal and draw me unto death, thy votary am I, O life. Reach out thy hands to me."
Wow, you know what? that was a great video. I mean, Chris of Vlogging Through History tells a story so well. I urge you to go and check out his channel. I don't think anyone's going to be watching this channel without already following Chris's channel. But if for some reason there is someone, make sure you go check it out. I will link that original video in the description below. I urge you, go and watch his video without me talking over it. Go watch his other videos because they're so great. Guys, in the meantime, thank you for taking the time to watch my video. Make sure you hit the thumbs up button for me. It helps me out loads and loads on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you on the next video.